All right. Welcome back to Introduction to Sociology. Today, we are going to be discussing W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. We're also going to be discussing Racist America, where we'll be talking about systemic racism theory by Joe Fagan. Okay, so just to give you a little introduction there. Also, this week, we'll also be looking at White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And at the end of this week, you will have your first exam, exam one, which will be on June 3rd. So that is in your syllabus. So make sure you are preparing for that. And I will go ahead and we can start with the instructions for exam one. So go ahead and go to the next slide where it says exam one instructions. And then the third slide here is where you will see exam one, C lecture video, which is for those students who generally don't watch the videos. They just look at the PowerPoint, which I wouldn't suggest doing that because you miss a lot of information. But exam one lecture video, the lecture video definitely gives you more information, more detail about what we are discussing. So exam one, see lecture video. The first point says your exam one will be available Friday, June 3rd at midnight. So same thing as your assignments or your quizzes, June 3rd at midnight. That is when your assignment will be, your exam will be available. There's sometimes I get feedback saying, well, why is it only available on a specific day? I think it's a little much to have an exam available for like a whole week or something like that. Plus, you know, ahead of time, and you have all day to complete it. So you don't have to complete it at, at one time. If you have family or you have, to work or you have something going on that day, you can always do what you need to do and then just set aside an hour or two to complete it. If it were in person, you would only have an hour or an hour and 15 minutes, to complete it. But online, you have 24 hours. So you have much longer in person than you do, much longer online than you do in person. So I think 24 hours as opposed to only an hour and a half or hour and 15 minutes is a good enough time to complete an exam and not 48 hours or 72 hours or a whole week. So you will have that one time and it's been on your syllabus. So you've had time to prepare for today, for June 3rd, whenever you're watching this, to complete, to clear your schedule for that. You will have 24 hours to complete the exam. It will be due at 11:59 p.m. on Friday, June 3rd. Okay, so you have 24 hours, and then at the end of the day on June 3rd, you will have you should have it submitted. There'll be 25 to 35 questions on the exam. The questions will be available under the assignments tab on the link that says exam one. So again, just like your quiz, it'll be exactly like that. You just, download it. It'll be there. You answer the questions and then you upload it. You can download the questions, answer them on the document, save your document with the answers, and then upload them before the deadline if you want to do that. Or you can download the questions, record the number to the questions and answers on a separate document and upload your answers before the deadline. So that's generally the two ways that people will complete the exam, right? It is a lot easier for me if you just download a separate document and then put the number to the questions, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if 1 is A, if 2 is C, if 3 is E, if 4 is C, if 5 is B, just do it that way. That's easy. Or, if you just want to actually answer the questions on the document, it's fine too. However you want to do it, as long as you answer them and then submit it. You will submit your answers under this assignments tab that says exam one in Canvas before the deadline. Okay. So a couple different things. First thing, going to the next slide, please be sure, please be sure to type the correct answer next to the correct number. If you do not, it can throw off your entire exam, and this can cause the rest of your answers to be wrong. So this means that if you want number 6 to be C, and you're looking at number 7, and you put number 7 as C and number 8 as A, and that's not what you meant, it'll throw off your whole question, your whole exam. So then by the time you get to the end, if let's say there's 30 questions on the exam, but you only have 29 recorded answers, now your exam is messed up. And if you submit it that way, whatever was off, it'll throw off everything else. So now, you have an exam that a lot of the answers are wrong, depending on when you started recording the wrong answers with the wrong questions. So make sure that you're paying attention. And if you do that, hopefully you do that in enough time to where you can make the adjustment. And it's not like right before it's time for the deadline. Upload the document with your answers in Word or PDF format. If you upload them in a format that I cannot download, you will not receive a grade for the exam, which can severely hurt your grade in the class. So don't upload anything in any format that is not Word or PDF. Some people upload in Pages, some people upload in, I don't know, whatever other format they have on these devices. And somebody usually does it every semester, and it, they don't get credit for the exam. So make sure that you're uploading it in Word or PDF format. Very, very, very important. Okay. I might get some of the following responses. My device stopped working. My Wi-Fi was down. My Canvas wasn't working. It wouldn't let me upload. Can I email you the screenshot of it not working? The answer to those questions will be, no, I'm sorry that happened. I understand that things do happen. I get it. And I try to work with students as best I can, but I don't know, right? I'm not sure. Students come up with all kinds of reasons as to why they can't do things that just happen to happen on the day of, and all these different things. So, but things like that happen, and I do understand that. And so my job and your job is to try to foresee these things and prepare so that if it does happen, if it does, lightning strikes, and on this particular day, this is the day that your Wi-Fi is down, or this is the day that your computer decides to act up, because stuff like that has happened to me before, so I get it. But if this is the day that this happens, it's always good to have a backup. Because things like that have happened to me before, I also understand, okay, if this is a day where I have to do an exam, or if this is the day where I have to do something very important, make sure I have a backup. Make sure I email it to myself. Make sure I'm somewhere that has a backup Wi-Fi. Make sure I'm doing something, or I'm taking into account anything that could possibly happen that could mess this up. That's just a part of being an adult, right? You have to do those things, because if not, and this is the day that you just have bad luck, we don't know what the end is going to be like, right? Sometimes some people may give you grace, but then sometimes people may not. And that's just life, right? So I'm just trying to prepare you for that by saying, you know what, just in case this does happen, make sure you're on the device where you can download and upload the exam. Don't try to take the exam on your phone. Don't try to take the exam on a random tablet or something, right? Try to do it on your laptop if you have a good laptop, or on your device at school, or something that is, or maybe at a library, at a local library, at the school library, somewhere where you can download and upload the exam. Make sure you are somewhere where you have Wi-Fi, okay? If you know your Wi-Fi is not good at home, in your apartment, or wherever, go somewhere where there's good Wi-Fi, right? There are places, right? Again, a local library, sometimes a McDonald's or a Starbucks or somewhere where you have good Wi-Fi, okay? Late submissions will result in significant point loss. Late or email submissions will result in significant point deduction. After about an hour, I won't take it at all. So sometimes students, I mean, I think I had this happen last semester. A student um, emailed the exam to me. I think it was in a different format or something. See, a lot of points off, a lot of points off. And there's really nothing I can do about that because, again, that's unfair to the students who did turn it in. And I'm not sure if you use that to try to get the correct answers. Some people do, some people don't, but I don't know for sure. So I can't grade it the same way. So I'm just, I'm just saying this for you to make sure that you are, doing everything that you can on your end, just in case something like this happens, extenuating circumstances happen, that you're prepared. So my suggestion would be submit the exam early, number one. Okay. If you know that, you have to work later on in the day, just do the exam in the morning, right? Maybe get up at like 6 or 7 in the morning, just take the exam, get it out the way, take about an hour or two to do the exam, get it out the way. And then that way you're done. Also, complete the exam in the library next to a computer with your laptop, just in case you can't upload it on your laptop. Then you can email it to yourself and upload it on the library computer. And if that doesn't work, you can do it on your phone. So that way you have a backup, you have your laptop, you have a backup computer, and you have your phone. So you have 3 devices, just in case one of them is not working. Email it to yourself. That way, if you do have your phone, you could just email the final document to your phone, and then you can upload it on your phone, right? So there's many ways that you can do it. Again, all about being an adult, thinking, 2 and 3 and 4 steps ahead, just in case. None of this stuff may not happen, and it just may be a regular good day, but at least you had this covered, right? If you are having trouble, make sure you save the document, restart your device, and then upload the document. You have to give yourself time to do this, as it may not be a good idea to try to do this 1 minute before the deadline. So sometimes, devices, they do weird things and you have to start them back over. Again, work on the exam early, just in case your device just freezes up. You didn't know it was going to do that. And then you have to start it back over. You can save it, but if you start it back over and it's 11:57, it may be past midnight by the time you have to submit the exam, and then your exam is late, right? And then you'll email me and say, I had to submit, I tried to screenshot, please, 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 please. And I'm saying, can't do that. So that's what I'm saying. You want to make sure you do it early. You want to make sure, this has been on the schedule for a while. So you know when the exam was, you knew you had 24 hours, you knew everything that happened for your exam. So, you know how it is. So make sure that you're on top of it. Make sure that you're doing everything you can to prepare, right? If you have any questions, you can reach out to me. In terms of studying for the exam is going to take up information from the beginning of the course all the way to the midpoint. So information from this lecture, the information, the lectures from this week, from last week, and the week before. Okay, so that'll give you, some time to work and make sure you study the materials from all of those lectures so that you are prepared. Okay. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And with that being said, we can go right into the voice. Okay, so social problem. To the real question, how does it feel to be the problem? This is the question that Du Bois starts out one of his seminal, well, probably his most seminal, most profound pieces of work to some people. If not his most profound, at least the one that is the most popular. Souls of Black folk. The question then is, well, who is Du Bois? Right? Why are we reading this person? Why do we need to know who W.E.B. Du Bois is? So, to answer that question, Du Bois is a world-renowned historian, sociologist, philosopher, thinker, and arguably one of the most important figures, definitely Black figures in the American century, the 20th century. He was born, I believe, in 1865 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He was a very smart man. He was mixed race, and he eventually would graduate high school very early. He was born free. He was not born into the same level of oppression as many other African Americans during that time. This does not mean that he himself did not experience issues related to Jim Crow, issues related to racism and inequality. However, there was a certain level of privilege that he had that many African Americans did not have at his time, during his time. He eventually would go on for college. He would go on to Fisk University, which is a historically Black college in Nashville, Tennessee, and there he would do very well. And then he would eventually go on to Harvard University, and he would become the first African American to graduate with a Ph.D. from Harvard University. While he was at Harvard University, he would study history. Let's see, wait a minute. And while Du Bois was studying history, he started to do work and study particularly the history of African and African American people in the United States. This is towards the end of the 19th century, end of the 1800s. He would eventually fly out to Germany, where he would do work with, I don't know if he flew, or I don't know if planes were popular at that time, maybe took a boat. But he would eventually go to Germany, where he would work under people like Karl Marx. He would become friends with people like Max Weber, and he started to learn about this new discipline called sociology. And he felt that sociology was the type of discipline that he could apply scientifically to race. What he started to realize is that Marx, while reading works from Das Kapital, Marx's Das Kapital, while he was reading works from Max Weber and many of his contemporaries, he was realizing that in these sociological works, nobody is talking about the racial issue. And maybe rightfully so, because again, this is Germany, this is 19th century. Race is not as salient of an issue in Germany as it is in the United States at this time, right? Of course, you had things like anti-Semitism, you had anti-Jewish hate, but the issues related to these strong racial categories were not as popular. And this is also prior to the Holocaust, right? Again, not to say that anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hate started with the Holocaust. We know that it was existing decades and decades before that. But again, that is when it kind of came to this global head. And now Marx does speak a little bit about race when he talks about class and labor in his works, but not much, right? Very few, if anybody, is talking about race and studying race scientifically, right? The most you would get was these what's called in the literature scientific racism, where you would get these pieces of works that talked about how the African head was big and these people came from being monkeys, and that's why they were uncivilized, and the reason why their bodies were big and their heads and their brains were small is because they're made to work and they weren't intelligent enough to fit in regular society, and they were made to be subservient, that kind of thing. So you had these very scientific racist thoughts, nothing that was substantial, that actually took Black people of African descent, specifically African Americans, and studied them like how poor people were being studied, how class was being studied, how capitalism was being studied. Nobody was studying race in this way. And so Du Bois said, okay, this is where I will make my contribution to the discipline. And so he eventually came back and he started to learn more and more about sociology. He merged it with his historical studies, and he wrote his dissertation, which was on African Americans in Farmville, Virginia. And it was here that he started to begin to hone his skills in sociology. After he graduated, and when he graduated, he wasn't really a big fan of Harvard. He wasn't. He experienced a lot of racism. He experienced a lot of hatred. His white colleagues and classmates many times would not talk to him. He was left alone. He had to study by himself. It was a very lonely and isolating time for the boys. And so he doesn't really speak a lot about his time at Harvard throughout his life. Now, you would have to go to a Du Boisian scholar to, like, somebody who's read, all of his thousands of pieces of work, who can really, speak to this much better than I can. But as far as I understand, he doesn't really talk much about Harvard. However, he does mention Fisk. He does mention how attending a Black college gave him the foundation and the confidence that he needed to move forward and be successful at Harvard. Obviously, coming from Harvard, coming from such a renowned school, did a lot for his career. I'm pretty sure, he was able to get second and third looks from jobs. But even then, after he graduated, he couldn't find a job, even though he graduated from the top school in the nation or in the world for that matter. He still couldn't get a job because of racism. So he eventually embarked in another study called the Philadelphia Negro. He participated in the study while living in Pennsylvania, and he was able to get funding for this study to study the way Black people of various social classes interacted with each other, right? And this piece of work was the work that he really used to help explain the issue of race in America scientifically. Nobody was looking at this scientifically. Everybody was talking about race from a historical standpoint, from this thing that happened in the antebellum South and the Civil War, but nobody was really studying these people to find out why is it that the United States, or why is it that these people are not able to compete on the same level as white folks in this country? And is there something structural going on in this country that is keeping one people at a disadvantage and allowing other people to be advantaged? Because the conversation or the argument is that yes, slavery happened, and it's clear that it was wrong, and it's clear that it provided barriers for Black people, right? That was something that wasn't argued between white or Black people. That wasn't we're talking about 30, 40 years after the Civil War. Nobody's arguing that you enslave a group of people, they're going to be backwards, right? They're going to be so-called uncivilized, or they're not going to have certain abilities or skills or be able to catch up to a people that's been free this entire time, in terms of education. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to give them those skills, educate these people so that they can compete on the same level as white folks, because you've allowed white folks to be free this entire time and you have enslaved these people this entire time. So that was clear. But now the question was, well, these people have been free for 30, 40 years. Why are they still in poverty? Why are they still so-called backwards? Why are they still uncivilized? All right, that's the question, that they were uncivilized. Why are they still uneducated? Okay, we've taken the chains off. We've gotten rid of slavery. They have equality now. We passed the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. They have the right to vote. They have the right to be citizens, right? Slavery has been abolished. We've provided schools. Now we have all of these Black colleges that have been funded by the Freedmen's Bureau, which is white tax dollars put aside to help fund education for Black people. We've sent the military down to the South to protect them from white vigilantes, from organizations that want to see these people back enslaved. We've done all that we can for these people. Why are they still uneducated? Why are they still in poverty? Why are they still backwards? That's the question, right? And so Du Bois says Well, let me study this. Let me go to the most densely, let me go to the area that has the densest population of Negroes, of Black people, of all classes, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and let me study this group and see if I can figure out what is the issue with, what is the racial issue in this country, right? Is it their fault? Is it the country's fault? Is it a mix of both? Is it what's happening? Let me study these people, put them under a microscope and get their experiences. It's easy if you're white to look on and say, well, this is the reason why. But if you're not hearing from these people's experiences, then the research is going to be biased. The conclusion is going to be biased. We already know what white people think about Black people. They write about it, they talk about it, they speak about it, they have minstrel shows about it. So it's clear about how the American whites feel about Black people at this time. Let's talk to them. And let's study how they're living. Let's study the ghettos. Let's study their schools. Let's study their institutions. Let's interview them. And let's see what are their experiences. What is the life that they live in? What is the country from their perspective? And then we can come to some conclusions on the race problem in America. So that's what he did. He triangulated his data. He interviewed thousands and thousands of African Americans. He went into their homes. He went into their communities. He went into their neighborhoods. He lived among them for 2 years in Philly to study and find out what is the social problem around race, or is race a social problem anyway? He did it and he came to his conclusions in the Philadelphia Negro. And then after that, he published those works, blew everybody away in academia. Nobody had ever looked at race in this way before. No one had ever thought to. And then from there, he took his philosophies from his dissertation on the Black folks in Farmville, Virginia. He took his philosophies from the Philadelphia Negro. He took his philosophies from the things that he was learning under Marx, things that he was learning from many of his contemporaries, and he created this book, collection of essays called Souls of Black Folk. And in this piece, this marks the first sociological, philosophical piece on race that was written by a Black man of his stature. This kind of starts the conversation and starts the dialogue of a scientific study about race. And he starts off by asking the question, how does it feel to be the problem? And then who is he talking to when he's asking this question? Because it seems that he's talking to Black people, but it's likely that Black people probably not going to be reading this book. Because a lot of Black people at this time, many Black people are not as educated. They don't have the opportunity to be educated enough to read this book. Some, maybe about 10%, what he called the talented 10, maybe, but a majority, no. So he's talking to Black people, but then he's really talking to Black people in front of white people because he knows that his audience is likely going to be a white audience. White academicians, white scholars. And he's asking them, Black folks, how does it feel to be the problem? People look at you as the problem. People, white America looks at you as the nuisance of society. What are we going to do with the Negro? Because he goes on to say in the text, the problem of the 20th century will be a problem of the color line. That will be the problem of the 20th century. That will be the issue that we will have to grapple with. And he wasn't wrong. From the beginning of the 20th century all the way to the end of the 20th century, there has been an issue of race. Race has been one of the single most important issues that America has had to deal with in the 20th century. Whether you're talking about the civil rights movement, whether you're talking about the lynching era, whether you're talking about mass incarceration, whether you're talking about Jim Crow and post Jim Crow, whether you're talking about unequal opportunities in education, race is the one thing that comes up every single time, and is typically a racial movement that ends up kicking off a women's movement, that ends up kicking off the sexual liberation movement. It's usually on the heels of a race movement. It's usually on the heels of some type of racial tension that has happened in America. It happened in the 19th century with the abolitionist movement, which then helped to kick off the women's suffrage movement. It happened in the 1960s, where it was the civil rights movement that, on the heels of that, helped to kick off the second wave of feminism movement in the 60s and 70s, which also helped to kick off the LGBTQ rights movement in the late 60s and 70s. And then you also had that happen with the Black Lives Matter movement. As the Black Lives Matter movement began to take shape, then you also had the Me Too movement. And then on top of that, you also had the movement to make same-sex marriage legal, all happening under the guise of these large protests that were happening because of racial conflict in America. So Du Bois was not lying. The problem of the 20th century was a problem of the color line. He was absolutely philosophic in that way. He was forecasting what America would look like based on his studies, and he was spot on. Ask the question, why did God make me a stranger in my own house? Why do I feel like a stranger in my home, in my own house, an outcast? And rightfully so. Because for Du Bois, what he's arguing is that you have, during this time, European immigration was very popular, especially in the late 19th century, where a lot of people were moving from, a lot of Irishmen, a lot of Italian men and women were moving from Europe, particularly to New York. They were living in what Jacob Rees calls how the other half lives. We talked about that. Living in tenements, living in government housing. In those areas, these shanty towns, well, what would eventually be called shanty towns, Hoovervilles, in the latter part or the early part of the 20th century, they were living in places like that. But these people were being treated better than the Negro, being treated better than Black folks. And he didn't understand why. Well, these Black people have been here for centuries. Parents were enslaved, literally built the White House and built these universities and built the highways that people are driving along. And why are they being treated like outcasts, like strangers in their own house? If anybody should feel connection to this country, it should be the Negro. But why is it that these other people are coming to this country and they feel the Pledge of Allegiance and they feel the story of America and they feel the promise of America and get treated and access to the promise of America quicker than these people? And this is their own, this is the house, this is the country that they built. Why is this happening? And remember, he's asking these people these questions in front of white people because he wants white people to look at Black people and finally allow the Black folks, the Negro, to have their own voice to explain why they feel like the problem, why they feel like an outcast, why they feel like they're a stranger in their own home. This piece is very important because it kicks off the dialogue of race. It's out of this piece that Du Bois then becomes a national and international scholar. He eventually gets a job at Atlanta University, where he would help to lead out the sociology and history program there. He would eventually move to Harlem, where he would help to lead out in the Harlem Renaissance. He would start a magazine there. He would help lead the Talented 10th movement there. He became friends and colleagues with some of the brightest minds of Black and white America. He would continue to teach, do research, train the next generation of sociologists. He would continue to write books. He would continue to fight for civil rights. He would eventually become a communist. and he would eventually promote voting, and then also participate in not voting because he didn't think that there was any point in it eventually. And then after all of his fighting and resisting and movements, he would eventually leave. He said enough was enough, and the United States was not the place for him, and that there was nothing that could be done to convince the white man essentially to provide equal rights and equal opportunities to the Negro. And so in the year that he moved to Ghana, well, in the year that he died, he had moved to Ghana. And in the year that he died, Dr. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. So um, um, Du Bois lived a very long life. He was a huge contributor to civil rights and human rights for Black people across the diaspora. He was a huge forefather of Pan-Africanism and an important philosopher and teacher and writer, not only for the United States, but for the world. And so this is why we are studying Du Bois, and this is why it's important for us to talk about Du Bois, and you can't have a conversation about sociology and about race and sociology without talking about Du Bois. We talked about social class. Remember, race, class, and gender, all those kind of three, that's the kind of triumvirate when we're talking about sociology. So we talked about social class, now we're talking about race, mentioning Du Bois, and we're going to talk about a couple other people, and then we're going to go into gender. So so that starts us off with the conversation about race and the conversation about Du Bois. So now let us go to the next slide, which is called the veil. And it is this concept of the veil that Du Bois explains as a gift on page 38. What he says is that the veil is this idea that the world yields the Black man no true self-consciousness. It only lets the Black man see himself through the revelation of the other world, right? Because of Jim Crow, because of racism, because of inequality, and because of the fact that Black people were stripped of their identity because of slavery, they could not create. His idea was that there was no true identity that the Black man was able to have, because the Black man could not identify with Africa, and the Black man, the Negro, could not identify with America. America didn't treat him, her, them as if they were a part of the country, but they were too far away, too far removed from Africa to feel connected to them. And so any type of identity that they would then eventually create, they could be that for themselves, but in being that for themselves, they also had to always see themselves from the perspective of the white man, the way in which white folks looked at Black people. It's always like, I know who I am, but then I also have to see me in the way that the world sees me. And that's typically what people who are oppressed, that is typically how they often have to navigate society. That is typically how they would have to move throughout the world. For example, if you're a woman, you have this veil, you have this, and we're getting ready, well, we can go into it now. You have this next slide, this double consciousness, right? Where you have to look at yourself, not only as a woman, not only as how you see yourself, but you also have to see yourself as men look at you. So that then dictates the type of clothes that you might wear, or how you may walk, or what you might say. Even if you know that there's no harm there, even if you know that there's not a sexual affront as to what you might say or what you might wear, you have to think about, how do men look at that? What would a man think? How would a man approach me if I say this, if I wear this. And that's not fair. It's not right because men don't have to think that way. Men don't have to think about what would a woman think if I put this on or if I say this, you typically. But if you are in a subordinate position, if you are in a lower class position in society, then you have to think about how does a person of a higher class position view what it is that I'm doing. And what Du Bois is arguing is this is the way that the Negro has to navigate society. He cannot think just of himself, but also how do white people look at what I'm doing? What do they think about me? It's almost like you have, okay, let's paint this picture. Let's say it's raining. You don't have an umbrella, but you have a hoodie. If you're a white person, you may take that hoodie, you may put it on and go about your day. And not think twice. But if you're a black person, you may put on that hoodie, but then you would also have to think, where am I going? If it stops raining, do I have a book bag to put this hoodie in? Because if I walk in a certain place with this hoodie on my head, I can be viewed as a thug, as a robber, as a delinquent. Not because of the hoodie, but because of who's wearing the hoodie. There's a book that I teach out of called Getting Real About Race. And there is, I believe it's either Dr. Rashawn Ray or Dr. I forgot his name, but he's a professor at Georgia College and State University who talks about that. Is it, obviously the symbol of the hoodie became popular because of the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman and the issue of being a hoodie, and does a hoodie symbolize, delinquency and being a thug and all these different things. And the issue is not the hoodie. The issue itself is the person wearing the hoodie. What skin is the hoodie covering? And did a good job by comparing these different people who wear hoodies. And had a picture of Trayvon, had a picture of these other people wearing hoodies. But the issue wasn't the hoodie, because if you look at Bill Belichick, who was the coach of the New England Patriots, he wears a hoodie every game. Every game. I don't think I've ever seen Bill Belichick wear anything other than a hoodie. And no one's ever assumed Bill Belichick was a thug or delinquent. Even though he looks really mean, I've never seen him smile either. Whether they win or lose, he looks really mean all the time. He's a mean-looking man in a hoodie, but guess what? He's a mean-looking white man in a hoodie. So it doesn't look as threatening. You know who else wears a hoodie a lot? What's his name? Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg wears a hoodie. He wears that, or he'll wear that like kind of plain white, plain gray shirt. No one would assume that Mark Zuckerberg was a thug or a gangster or a delinquent. Because it's not the hoodie itself as much as it's the person wearing it. So a white person wearing a hoodie probably wouldn't think twice about where they're going. They could be going to class. They could be going to a friend's house. They could be going to do something wrong. Wouldn't think twice. But a black person would have to. Why? Because black people have a certain level of double consciousness, which says, going back to the slide, they always have to look at themselves through the eyes of other people. They have to measure their soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. By a world that looks on them in amusement. Wow, look at these people. Sometimes look at them, they're creative. Sometimes, wow, listen to their music. Wow, sometimes look at their culture, but also amused, like, man, these people go through a lot. And wow. To be studied, to be looked at, to be gawked over. While at the same time, they're also looked at in contempt. Oh, I can't stand these people. Oh, I don't like these N words. Why do they do this? Why do they complain? Why are they marching? Why is this? So there's this amusement in who they are, but then there's this contempt about who they are. And then many people also look at them, like the boy says, in pity. Man, I feel sorry for those people. Always getting killed, always getting shot at, always having to fight some kind of injustice or inequality, having to deal with living in certain neighborhoods or certain, again, this idea that there's this one impoverished class, right, of Black folks. And we haven't gone into the, fact that there's middle class, upper middle class, lower class Black people. But there's this idea that there's this kind of proletarianization of race, of Black people, that they're all just kind of impoverished race, right? And so there's this amused perspective, there's this contempt perspective, and then there's this perspective of pity that people look, particularly white folks, look at Black people with, according to Du Bois, which is part of this double consciousness. And then he says, and so for Black folks, they have these warring ideas. They're American and they're Negro. They're African and they're American. They have these two identities that keep going back and forth. They feel Black, they feel African, but then they feel American. And they don't know which one because they don't feel accepted by either group. And there are two unreconciled strivings that go back and forth. And it is only the strength of their identity, the strength of who they are, the strength of where they come from, and the hope of where they're going that only keeps them alive. Because they're dealing with these warring identities all the time. And they're navigating life, coping, and switching between two identities, sometimes 3 and 4 identities. And this is what Du Bois picked up while studying Black folks in Philly, while studying Black people in Pennsylvania. And he realized this, and he brought this to the attention of the US masses. Because again, nobody had put Black folks under a microscope and really sat and talked to them to understand their experiences. And when they did this, it started to make more sense. Du Bois's ideas are now starting to uncover and allowing the United States to realize that there is a deeper problem in their society, a problem that is much bigger than the fact that the Negro is the problem. And we're getting ready to get there in a second. And so going to the next slide, we see on pages 40 and 41, again, the question is asked, well, why can't the Negro, Black people, come up? Why are they complaining? Why have they not caught up with white people in society? Why are they not as educated? Don't they have the same opportunities? And basically what Du Bois says is, no, they don't. Yes, you've taken the chains off, the physical chains off, but the social chains and the economic chains, you've not taken those off yet. By the time, yes, Black folks had the right to vote. I can't remember, I think it was in 1870 something, was when they got the right to vote, sometime during Reconstruction. But then by the end of the 19th century, you reverse that. Once Jim Crow was in full effect after 1896, you reverse that. So by the time Du Bois is writing this, or at least by the time he published it, Black folks didn't have the right to vote anymore. They also don't have the right to go to school. They don't have the opportunities to go to school in the same rate as white people. White people have way more options when it comes to K through 12, and especially college. Black folks don't have those opportunities. They don't have the same opportunities for jobs. The Negro is getting paid way less than white folks were getting paid at that time. And still to this day, the average Black worker still makes much less than the average white worker. And we're not even talking about the gender wage gap. We haven't even gone there yet. So the fact is that there are all of these other barriers that are keeping these people at a disadvantage. It's not that they are the problem. What Du Bois starts to uncover is that the problem of race is not an individual problem. It is a what? A social problem. It is not that these people are the problem to the US society. It is that US society is a problem to these people. Thus, they have not contributed the maximum amount of potential that they can to this country because you have not allowed them to. And so on pages 40 and 41, Du Bois starts to argue that ever since the abolishment, so-called abolishment of slavery, ever since the 13th Amendment was passed, these people have been on a search for freedom. They've tried to find freedom. They tried to practice it. Some of the first things that they've done was to start businesses for themselves, educate themselves, tried to vote. They thought that by voting, this will be the key to equality. Why? Because voting is at the very helm of this democracy. This is the biggest representation of a free and civilized society in this time period. The fact that we lived in a democracy, the fact that there was one vote, one representation, we did not live in a monarchy. We did not live in a place where one person can be free to rule over people for however long they want to, pass laws arbitrarily, without any type of checks or balances. We didn't live in that society. This was France. This was Great Britain. This was communism. We weren't that. We're so much more advanced. One person, one vote. The people have the power. And so Black folks are like, yes, this is the country we need to live in, where people have the power, where the citizens have the rights. And as long as we can participate in that, now we can show that we're smart enough to vote the right people in office that are going to represent our interests, that are going to represent the people, that are going to be fair and equal and help us maintain a fair and equal and egalitarian society. But what happened? A few decades later, their voting rights got rolled back. Couldn't do it. So they said, okay, well, we can't do it through voting. Education. We're going to be educated. We're going to prove that we can go to these schools, that we can learn at the same level, learn at the same pace. We know that we're intelligent. All we have to do is prove it to the white man that we're intelligent enough to go to their schools, to sit next to them, to learn, to compete in the labor market. And if we can do that, then we can show that we deserve freedom. And that's what they did. They went to their Black colleges. They went to the white colleges when they were allowed to. They became successful. You had many Du Boises. You had Du Bois, you had Carter G. Woodson, you had Langston Hughes, you had Zora Neale. I mean, you had people, Black folks at that time, who were getting master's degrees and doctorate degrees, and Claude McKay, I mean, many, many, many others, to show that, hey, yes, we are intelligent. We are not as backwards. We are not as uncivilized. We can even be more civilized than you. We can be greater Americans than you can be if you just give us the opportunity. And we can show you through getting an education. Try to do it through education, but at last, even the educated elite still did not have the freedom that their white counterparts had. They were living only just a little bit better than their poor Black counterparts. So then it led Du Bois to ask the question, to be a poor man is hard, or to make the statement, to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the bottom of hardships. Du Bois says, you have created so many barriers in this society for these people. And what you've done is, you've done it while forcing them to look on through a window, glass darkly, if you want to use a biblical references, a glass darkly, to see that there's so many opportunities. If you're a poor man in a poor country, you understand poverty. If you're a poor person in Madagascar, very, very poor country, it's understandable. But if you're an entire poor race in a land that is overflowing with wealth, well, now that's the bottom of hardships. Because not only are you a poor person in a land that is overflowing with wealth, but it's you and it's all these other people that look like you that are also impoverished. Now we go back to sociological imagination. What is the difference between a trouble and an issue? A trouble is when something affects one person. If I can't find a job, if me, Jonathan Grant, can't find a job, it's probably, but other people that look like me and don't look like me, they all have jobs. You would tell me, well, maybe you should check your resume. Maybe you should go back to school. Maybe you should get more skills. But if I can't find a job and I identify as a Black male, can't find a job, and then a whole bunch of other Black males can't find jobs, and we all have varying degrees, varying skills, varying looks, varying educational statuses, and none of us can find jobs, then you might say, that's not the trouble. That's an issue. Somebody's not hiring you guys. It's not that you can't do it, clearly, because all of y'all have different skills. So obviously you must be, something must be happening. There's something larger that is stopping you from being able to do this. And so Du Bois says the same thing. If these are just poor men, this would be one thing. But this is an entire race that is impoverished. Even the middle class, even the educated elite are still coming upon these same problems that the poor people are coming from. When they go to try to vote, they get turned around just like the poor Blacks get turned around. When they try to get a house in a nice neighborhood, they get refused just like the poor Blacks get refused. So they're coming up against these same issues. And remember what we said when we talked about social class. Poverty is not just economics. You can be impoverished politically. You can be impoverished socially. You can be impoverished culturally. And so what Du Bois is saying is we are a poor race. This is the proletarianization of an entire race. You have made this entire race a race of poverty. That's not an individual problem. That's a social problem. And that's not a problem of the people. That's a problem of the society in which the people are living. And so then, to address the issue of why the Black man is not caught up to the white man, he says a people thus handicapped ought not to be asked to race with the world, but rather given the opportunity to handle and deal with their own problems. Give them the time to deal with their own social problems before then you ask them to race with the rest of the world. How can they race with the white man? How can they race with the Asian man? How can they race with all of these other people who have not been enslaved for centuries, who have not been oppressed by Jim Crow for decades? And then all of a sudden you wake up and say, now go and get the same education and have the same experiences and have the same skills, and they don't have the right to vote, and they don't have the right to participate in the wealth building process, and they don't have the same access to opportunities or the same access to knowledge that will get them those opportunities. You can't do that. Leave them alone, give them the opportunities that you have, and then allow them to deal with whatever social problems exist within their society. And then you can now expect them to race with the rest of the world, but allow them to be on a level playing field first. You can't put them on a lower playing field and then as people are rising, wonder why they're not rising when you've never allowed them to be on the playing field in the first place, on a level playing field in the first place. So this is where Du Bois starts the conversation around race. This piece, Souls of Black Folk, again, ends up permeating cultures, identities, schools of thought, and starts a very important and very salient dialogue on race, particularly race in the 20th century. Which is why we start the conversation and the lectures around race with, at least I like to start it with Du Bois, so that we at least know the foundation, because after this is when we start going into other different types of, well, in a much longer class, we would talk more about race, many different theories around race, many different concepts, because obviously race changes in the 20th century. You have other racial groups that are now coming into the country, and so it is complicating the concept of race in many ways, and it is starting to allow race to be even more philosophical, even more political, and make even more a practical dent in our society. And so, you know, then it becomes a much, much deeper and much more complicated issue. And so I like to start here as a foundation before we go into all of that. But we're not able to do all of that in one, summer semester. So we just kind of talk about this, a few other thoughts, and then we'll go into other social identities. With that being said, I would like for you to watch this link, the Unequal Opportunity of Race video. I would like for you to watch that. Click on that. You can leave this lecture, click on that, and then come back, and then I'll let you know what we're going to do from there. All right. So what I would like for you to do is I would like for you to visit the discussion board on Canvas. This is the next slide. And I want you to create a post answering the questions below. And afterwards, you will respond to another student's post, and you will be graded on if you answer the questions and how well you answer the questions. And you will also be graded on the substance of your response to another student's post. And the deadline to do this is June 3rd. Okay. So this is on one of your assignments. Again, also you have this is one of your assignments for this week, and you will answer the question: what did you take away from watching this video? What messages did you receive? Do you agree with the ideas the video was putting forth? Why not? And what systemic racist issues did you see in the video that still exist today? And what ideas from the lecture and Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk reading did you see in the video? This is a very important part. I definitely want to make sure that you are able to pick out pieces from the reading, certain things that we've talked about in the reading and in the lecture. I want to make sure that you're able to see those things in the video. So if you can answer these questions well, and you can, give me some good answers and respond in a solid way, again, make sure you go back to the syllabus and you read how you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to participate in your discussion board, then you will receive full credit. Okay. All right. And now we will go to the next part, which is systemic racism, and we'll talk about Joe Fagan's Racist America. So systemic racism is the theory that we're going to be discussing that was created by, well, not created, but given the name, if you will, by Joe Fagan. Before we go too deep into that, I think it's important for us to first talk about this foundation for racism, right? So we talked about Du Bois, we talked about Souls of Black Folk, and we talked about how this idea of race became something that was scientifically studied. If we go back further than that, it's safe to say that while the transatlantic slave trade did not invent the idea of race, what the transatlantic slave trade did, which for those who don't know, the transatlantic slave trade is the slave trade that existed where Europeans would take material goods based out of Europe, and then they would come to Africa. They would trade those goods for African people. Then they would put those African people on slave ships. They would bring them to the Americas. They would bring them to the islands. They would bring them to the American South. They would trade those African people for goods and or for money, goods or money. Then they would take those goods or money and then they would go back to Europe and they would do it all over again. That was called the transatlantic slave trade, sometimes called the triangular slave trade. Okay. And that was the slave trade that led to the creation essentially of the modern African American, right? So if you look at many African Americans are products of or probably had more than likely had family members, great grandmothers, great grandfathers, who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade, the triangular slave trade. Okay. While that was not the first time racism had ever reared its ugly head in Earth's history, it was quite possibly the biggest example of racism. There's another book that sometimes we read. We didn't read for the summer because we didn't have enough time, but there's a book called A Short History of Race by George Fredrickson that kind of speaks to where race and racism kind of began. But so we're going to skip all of that, which kind of deals with anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hate. It's kind of like the kind of start of it. It kind of created the environment for Black on white racism, right? That kind of led to both the Arab slave trade as well as the transatlantic slave trade. But we're not going to really go too deep into that right now. We're just going to jump straight into this. Okay. And so what you have is you have now in the Americas, you have Black folks, right, who are now enslaved subordinate people. And then you have white people who are in periods, who are in positions of dominance, right? Slavery itself is quite possibly a more north or a southern thing, even though it existed in the north for a while, largely because of the climate in the north. It could not be sustained. The climate and the geographical features of the north would not really allow for slavery to be something that could be maintained, which is why Northerners ended up freeing these enslaved Africans much earlier than a lot of Southerners did. It just wasn't as feasible. Not because they necessarily cared more about Black people, just the system wasn't as feasible up there, right? So have this going on as is happening. Eventually the Constitutional Convention gets written. America fights for its freedom, leads on to the Constitutional Convention, et cetera, et cetera. Now there is this going back and forth of what is property and who is property. There is this famous phrase in the Constitution called life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But prior to the pursuit of happiness, the initial phrasing of that phrase was life, or the initial wording of that phrase was life. Every man has the right to life, liberty, and property. Property was another name for slavery, right? Because Black people were seen as property at that time. Property is the main object of society. Owning a property, exploitation of property, and using property to then make a profit is what was the main object of society in that time. How can I protect my property? Obviously, these have implications around slavery and human subordination, and early, American leaders, early US leaders did not want this to be attached to their name historically. So this was changed. You also there's also this notion that, or there's also the fact that the idea of slavery is implied in early documents of the United States, but never explicitly stated because they knew it was wrong. They knew that, and they did not want that to be part of their story, right? But you still had these implied ideas around inequality and slavery with things like the Three-Fifths Compromise, with things like the Fugitive Slave Act, et cetera, that you can find in early documents about about the history of the United States, right? And so this idea around slavery and around inequality began to forge what we would start to call the concept of race, right? Race becomes then something that is not just identical or economics, but it's also political, because now we have to pass laws around what a certain race can do. So the first thing we do is we create what race is for economic purposes. That was the reason for it, right? Capitalism predates racism. So you need to create something that is going to allow you to make a profit. You create this idea of race, and then you politicize it by now creating laws. These people can be enslaved for, starts out 7 years, then 12 years, then 30 years, then 50 years, then indefinitely. Then you start to create laws saying that these people can't vote, that these people can't marry these people, that if an enslaved man and if an enslaved woman and a white man have a baby, that child that automatically takes the status of the mother. These kinds of laws now politicizes race bodies and makes race a political issue, right? Moving that forward, we start to see now we have to create a justification for this, which is why we get this idea of natural law. Natural law was used to justify the enslavement of Africans by saying that African people were by nature subordinate people based on their brain sizes, based on their history, based on the fact that they were uncivilized, that they lived in jungles in Africa, and they did not come from civilized societies like people in Europe, etc. The same natural law was used to justify the genocide of Native Americans, manifest destiny. It was God's destiny for white people, for European people to be able to take over and use land to their benefit. It was God's doing that the European would come to the Americas and expand and move essentially Native Americans off of their land and take over, because the Europeans were better people, were smarter, and would be able to use this land to essentially create more opportunities for everyone. And God had not called any other group to be able to do this. This was a kind of Protestant idea called manifest destiny. And that was used to justify the genocide of Native Americans. The natural law was used to justify the mistreatment of women by saying that it was by law and it was by natural law that men were the superior being and women were inferior. So it's these natural law justifications, substantiations that created inequality in our society. Going back to race, there's this thought that, well, the people up north were liberal, were the ones that felt as though everybody should be treated equally, and it was Southerners who were the ones who were perpetuating slavery. But this is not necessarily the case, because what Fagan finds out in his reading and in his study of racist America, where he's looking at these old documents and looking at the foundations or how race is part of the foundational makeup of America, what he ends up finding is that there are all of these examples of racism in early America. 12 out of the first 16 presidents practiced slavery. Early founders, the early Quakers, the early American Psychiatric Association, all supported slavery. There were these, again, early documents that supported slavery. In fact, many of the white people that were anti-slavery early on, this is before the abolitionist movement became popular. Early on, they were anti-slavery, not because it was humanly wrong, not because it was morally wrong, but because it made white people lazy. This is what white folks said. This is what Fagan finds in his text. I'm gonna tell you who Fagan is in a second. But this is what the author of Racist America finds. He says that early white Americans were the ones that were anti-slavery because they thought that slavery made white people lazy, meaning if the French are gonna attack us, if the Spanish are gonna attack us, if the Germans are going to attack us, we need to be able to defend this country. How are we going to be able to defend the country if we have a group of white men that don't know how to work? If we have a group of white men that don't know how to struggle? If we have a group of white men that have a whole nother race of people working for them so that they have no idea what to do when it's time for battle? They're not going to be strong enough. They're not going to be quick enough. They're not going to be smart enough to be able to suffer and fight through the jungles and the woods and everything else that comes with fighting in the military, especially at that time. They're not going to be able to do that when we are attacked. And we won't let these Black people fight for us. That's not going to happen because there's a certain status, there's a certain symbol, there's a certain respect that you get when you fight for your country, and we don't want to give that to them. So the only people that can fight for this country is white folks, but they're not going to be strong enough because they are participating in a system that is not preparing them for any type of hard labor. The hard labor is being done by these Black folks. So that was the reason why a lot of people were anti-slavery, not because it was morally wrong, but because of the negative effects it would have on America. So this is the reason why Fagan is saying that the very foundation for America is racist. Who is Joe Fagan? Joe Fagan is the former president of the American Sociological Association. He is a renowned race scholar, author, professor at University of Florida, Texas A&M University. He's published, oh my goodness, I don't know how many books and articles, a whole lot. He is, he taught my professors who also taught me. He's also taught other professors in the sociology department at UNF. He is he's been studying race since the 1970s. He's a white man who has been looking at race and the issues of race in America for a very, very, very long time. And this notion of systemic racism, he did not come up with this idea. In fact, this idea of systemic racism was really probably started by Du Bois. He's kind of the one that kind of created the idea, again, that there was a structure that was put in place that kept these people at a disadvantage. He just didn't call it systemic racism. But he was the one that brought about the social constructionist idea of race, in that race was a social construction, or race was an issue that should be studied socially and not on an individual level. Well, I mean, you could psychologically study race, but in terms of looking at it, it's supposed to be looked at. The race was a social problem, not the people who were the victims of race, right? We just talked about that. So Fagan kind of takes it to this next level. Eventually, he gives it a name, systemic racism. And the reason why is because, and the reason why he does this is because there's this conversation that's being had. This book comes out in the 1990s, and there's conversation being had of why do we keep talking about race? Why do we even keep discussing it? Isn't it over? This past civil rights movement, Black people got opportunities now. We have Black professors, we have Black teachers, we have Black leaders and CEOs. How are we still talking about it? Well, because racism keeps showing up, it keeps rearing its ugly head. We keep having issues of police violence. We keep having issues of sexual misconduct. to Black women by Black men and by white men. We keep having issues of voting fraud. We keep having issues of rising um, criminalization of Black men. We keep having these same problems in the country, which is the reason why race keeps coming up. And so then somebody asked the question, well, is it these people? Is it the Black people that keep bringing it up? They're the ones that keep talking about it. The more they talk about it, the more it's going to be a problem. And Black folks are saying, no, we keep talking about it because it's an issue. And so Fagan says, well, let's try to get to the bottom of it. And so he begins to go on the scientific study of historical documents. He does a historical analysis of race in America to find out why does race keep coming up? And what he finds is that race is an issue in America because race is at the very foundation of what America is. It's a part of the American story. It's a part of the very fabric of this country. And if you look back at the documents, if you look back at the people, if you look back at the history of America, racism is front and center. And so we have to talk about it. It's almost as if you have a house, but the house has a rocky foundation. You can rebuild the walls, you can rebuild the roof, you can paint it, you can make the house look as beautiful as you want. But that house is always going to remind you every couple of years that foundation is rocky. And not until you fix that foundation, something's going to slide, something's going to go wrong, there's going to be a crack somewhere, something's going to happen to remind you that it's a rocky foundation. And that's what racism is. It's a rocky foundation. The United States is built on a rocky foundation. Racism is that rocky foundation. And no matter how great you make it look, no matter how many Black people you put in positions of power, no matter how many people of color you put in positions of power, unless you deal with the foundational aspects of racism in this country, it's going to keep rearing its ugly head. And this is the argument that Fagan is making. And so he goes all the way back to the beginning to find out how deep does race go in terms of being a part of the foundational elements of this country. And when he does that and uncovers that from a historical standpoint, then he goes to the next slide. Then he tells us this is the reason why there is an issue like systemic racism. Because then the question remains, well, racism is just a problem where people are being racist. If people would stop being racist, then racism wouldn't exist, right? It means all we have to do is just wait for these old racist people to die, and then racism won't exist. All we have to do is just not allow people to be racist, and then racism doesn't exist. And what Fagan is saying is he's saying, no, it's not that simple. Even that's not simple, but it's not even that simple. Because you can get rid of if you could magically get rid of all the racist people in America, racism would still exist because racism is a part of the structure of America. It's a part of the systems within America. America would not be what it is without racism. Because America has created a diverse assortment of racist practices, unjustly gained economic and political power of whites, providing continuing resources of inequalities and white racist ideologies that shape attitudes, institutions, and create and preserve white advantages and power, this is why we have what is called systemic racism. These racist practices, where everything from slavery to lynching to Jim Crow, created unjustly gained economic and political power of whites. Meaning when you stop a large number of people from being able to vote, that means everybody up until 1965 who gained political power was not supposed to be in power because they achieved that power unjustly. Because you had half the population who couldn't vote, which was women, and you had a good number of the population that couldn't vote, which were Black people and people of color. There was also unjustly gained economic power because a lot of the economic powerhouses in this country, banks, universities, research institutions, very, 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 very rich families all got their money off of slave money. They all received money and power and opportunities. Many times it was connected to slavery or some level of inequality or exploitation, largely under the guise of race. Then you have these continuing resource of inequalities where you have wage gaps between racial groups, where you have education gaps between racial groups, where you have health gaps between racial groups. And then in addition to that, you have the white racist ideologies, colorblindness, victim blaming. All of these white racist ideologies that suggest the criminality of Black people that now shape the attitudes of a whole new generation of white folks. These white people then get into power and they have power over institutions like our health institutions, our law enforcement institutions, our political institutions, our financial institutions, and they take these ideas, they take these attitudes, they take their beliefs and they infuse it into these institutions that are now used to help ensure that white people continue to stay in power and Black people continue to stay subordinate, or people of color essentially continue to stay subordinate, most people of color. And so systemic racism basically says that racism is not just an individual issue, it is an issue within our systems. So when we talk about police misconduct among predominantly Black people, we're not just saying that there are just police officers who are racist or police officers who don't like people of color, particularly Black and Latinx people. No, what we're saying is that there is a system that supports these people. We all know that there's good and bad people in every racial group. There's good and bad people in every occupation. But what should happen is that whether a person is good or bad, right or wrong, the system should be colorblind. The system should say, regardless of if a person is good or bad, even if you have a police officer who was wrong for what they did, they should not be supported by a system that will support those actions. Once you get in front of a judge, once you get in the courtroom, once you go through the proper channels, you should get to a point where right is going to be supported and wrong is going to be punished, period. When that's not the case, then that's when we say systemic racism occurs. That's when we say the system then supports the few bad apples, they say, the few bad apples in law enforcement, or the few bad apples in the healthcare system, or a few bad apples in the housing market. When you have a whole housing market that supports redlining, a whole housing market that supports racial segregation among housing, which then affects who can have access to certain wealth building opportunities. When you have a whole system that supports unequal access to education, where the education in predominantly Black neighborhoods in most US cities are a lot poorer, classrooms are more crowded, the materials and the resources are subpar in comparison to the resources and resources and materials in predominantly white institutions. That's systemic. It's not just one or two bad teachers or one or two bad principals or one or two bad schools. That's an entire system. It's not a trouble, it's an issue. And so what Fagan is saying is that there is an entire system that is based on creating advantages for white people and creating disadvantages for Black people and people of color in general. And so every aspect of society is created or shaped to some degree by core racist realities. Race essentially is a reality for every issue in our society. Then he goes on to say that dehumanization is the psychological dynamic of systemic racism, meaning that in order for you to be racist, you need to first not see somebody as human. In order for you to practice gender inequality, in order for you to treat a woman, mistreat a woman, or not feel that a woman has the right to her own body and her own mind, you have to first see that woman as not human or subhuman. You have to first see that woman as someone who is not as human as a man. In order for you to treat a person of color differently or worse than you treat a white person, you have to first believe that people of color are not human or are not as human as white people. So you have to first take away the humanity of a certain group of people before you can now put in practice systemic racism. And that's what occurred during slavery. A lot of these early institutions, a lot of these banking institutions, these housing policies, these medical institutions, we talk about J. Marion Sims, who was considered the father of modern American medicine, and he used enslaved women as test dummies for his early experiments, cutting them open without any anesthesia, right? Doing surgery on Black people because he believed, again, the white racist ideologies and attitudes, he believed Black people did not feel pain. And use this to create ideas and thoughts and philosophies around early medicine that is still used today. That is what Fagan is saying. This is racist America. At the foundation of the American medical system, this stuff is built on mistreating certain groups of people, particularly Black people. How was he able to do that? Again, it starts with the dehumanization. Oh, I don't believe these people feel pain. I don't believe these people are human. So because they're not human, now I can treat them a certain way. And because now I can treat them a certain way, I can take these same ideas and put it into the medical institution. And now these ideas are carried on centuries and centuries after I'm gone. That is what we mean when we say systemic racism, structural racism. And it starts with first this notion of dehumanization. Right? And so then it leads people to ask the question, going to the last slide. Well, what about the fact that racism doesn't exist anymore? Well, slavery doesn't exist anymore. Jim Crow doesn't exist anymore. Why are we still talking about race? Why are we still talking about racism? Why is racism still an issue? So Joe Fagan is saying just because slavery is done away with, just because Jim Crow was so-called done away with, does not mean that the effects of a racist foundation does not exist. Yes, America has done a lot to try to remedy and fix the issue of race in America. But again, if you have a rocky foundation, you're going to feel the effects of that foundation. If you have a house and you have a rocky foundation on a house, you're going to continue to feel it over and over again. It may sit dormant for a while. You may be able to fix something and you may not hear about it for a year, 2 years, 3 years, but eventually something else is going to happen. That's going to remind you, oh, there's a crack in the foundation. I forgot. And there are effects of a racist foundation. One of them is that the system of slavery stimulated the economy. Most of your big economic institutions, most of your big banks, most of your rich people, very, very rich, wealthy families, the ones that date all the way back to that time period, and for sure a lot of your universities were all either started or maintained through slave money. The United States is the richest or one of the richest countries in the world, for sure. But it is the only country that got that wealthy, or is the wealthiest country in the world based on slave money. If you take that out of the way, the United States wouldn't be as rich, and the richest country would be China. The only reason why China is not the richest country is because the United States got rich off of hundreds of years of free labor. Even a few decades of free labor will have you with more wealth than you can possibly imagine. This was centuries of free labor. So the system of slavery stimulated the economy and gave the United States the wealth necessary to be able to be a superpower. Then it created generational wealth on an individual level. So you have certain families, even middle class families, even if you yourself come from a middle class family, white middle class, I'm assuming there's not like any super, super, super wealthy, maybe some super wealthy people in here. I don't know. But most people are, right, like kind of middle class, if you will. And even if you were to go back and do the history of your family, if you're a person who's white, you may find, especially if you're from the South, you may find that your great 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 grandfather or mother or whatever participated in the slavery process. Maybe they didn't have 30 and 40 because only really really rich people could have that many enslaved Africans working for them, but maybe one or two. But that's enough to help you. That's enough. Just having one or two free, persons working for you for free could stimulate your family wealth for generations. So it's possible. And if you do, I know Henry Louis Gates and many other historians will just kind of, do the family genealogy, family history of many celebrities. I don't know if you ever watched that on PBS, but he'll do the family genealogy of celebrities, and a majority of the white celebrities that he does the family genealogy for, they find out that their parents or great 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 grandparents participated in the slave process, and that money that they used, they were able to pass that money on to the next family, and then and their children and their grandchildren, and even the ones that didn't even know about slavery, didn't practice slavery, never liked it, always thought people should be equal based on race. They thought that, but they still got money from the slavery process. And those things get passed on. If your grandfather fought in a war, in World War II or the Korean War, he probably got what's called the GI Bill, which gave him opportunities when he got back from the war to go to college for free, to get a house for free, to then get a good job. And then after he passed on, he was able to pass that money on to your parents and pass that money on to you, which is why a lot of people, particularly white people or white people from middle class families, probably have grandparents who are able to fund their college. Where did that money come from? It came from policies that were created that allowed for them to be able to build wealth and then pass it on to their children. But did everybody get those opportunities? No. Because Black people that fought in the Korean War and World War II didn't get the GI Bill. My grandfather fought and didn't get the GI Bill because he was Black. So my family grew up in the projects, fought side by side with white men, fought side by side with white soldiers, but because of the color of his skin, he was not allowed to participate in that wealth building process. Therefore, a whole different generational line. So again, these are the effects of a racist foundation. Something that happened way back then affected me today. If I was white, my grandfather comes home, he can probably make enough money to pay for my college, and now I have no college loans. But because he was Black, he didn't have that, grew up in poverty. Now that creates a line of impoverished people. I still get to go to college, but now I got a lot of student loan debt that a lot of my white counterparts don't have. So again, this is the effects of a racist foundation. While people are not still enslaved, the systems that were created of slavery and inequality still affect people to this day. Then you have you have things like colorblind racism, where people feel as though racism is gone. And so they say they're colorblind. I don't see race. And those kinds of ideas create a whole different kind of racism. A different kind of racism that's opposed to affirmative action. A different kind of racism that blames the victim for things that occur. So now you've created not only overt racism, but then this kind of covert racism, typically kind of seen in the post-civil rights era. And then also the internalized oppression that exists. So now The racism that has been taught by white people to people of color now get perpetuated by people of color, meaning the idea that white or lighter skin is better. Now people of color start to say, oh, lighter skin is better than darker skin. Straight hair is better than curly hair or nappy hair. Light eyes are better than dark eyes. Light skinned people are better than dark skinned people. And so you have this internalized oppression that exists among people of color, whether it's Black light skin, dark skin, or Indian light skin, dark skin, or Latinx light skin, dark skin, Asian light skin, dark skin. And I've seen it all. Even when I visited China to do research, there were differences in how people were treated between lighter skinned Chinese people and darker skinned Chinese people. I have a colleague who's Indian who's getting her PhD. She's a darker skin, and she always talks about how her family treats her and her brother different because she's a darker skinned Indian and he's a lighter skinned Indian. All of that comes from the larger issues of race in the world that we live in. So these are the larger effects of a racist foundation, and these help us have the conversation around systemic racism. So when we talk about race in this class, and when we talk about the issues of race, we're talking about race as a structural issue, not an individual issue. We're not saying that every white person is racist, or we're not saying that every, we're not saying that when we talk about race, we're just talking about one person who thinks that white people are better than people of color. What we're saying is that these ideologies and attitudes are a part of the very fabric of America and part of the institutions that exist in our country. And even if people did not believe those things, it will still exist because it's a part of the makeup, it's a part of the foundation. So that is the way in which we construct and discuss race and sociology. Right? So that is that. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, email, inbox, come into the office hours. I'll be more than happy to help you. Hope you have a great day, great week, great weekend. There's another lecture on white fragility that you will have to look at. Make sure you study that and make sure you study all of this material for your exam 1. See you soon. Yes, have a great day.